Hello, everybody. It is 5 o'clock, which means it is time to start Lambda's mini boot camp. Welcome, everyone. I love to see all the conversation in Slack that's happening. It seems like you guys are all really excited for this course. I'm really excited to teach you. So let me start by introducing myself. My name's Deandra Ryan Moss. I'm an instructor here at Lambda School. My first programming experience was in the 9th grade when I decided to learn HTML and CSS so I could make myself a rad MySpace page. And I have found various ways to continue to program since then. I was a software engineer for 2 years, but I love to teach. And so I transitioned over into the teaching aspect of it. And now I work for Lambda School, teaching you guys how to code. And it's pretty great. I'm also a math enthusiast and a musician. Side notes about me. And I am teaching you tonight live from Bisbee, Arizona. So enough about me, let's talk about Lambda School. For starters, I want to do a couple housekeeping items I want to mention. First is that we do ask you guys to sign in just once. So just for this first night, you'll need to give us your name and email, and that should be prompted through the Slack bot. So keep an eye out for a notification from the Slack bot, and it's important that you do that because that's how we put you in groups for the homework. Beyond that, there's no need to sign in or anything for the rest of the course. The second thing I wanted to mention is Slack. Slack is huge. That is how you communicate with me during this course. So I don't monitor the YouTube chat. So if you want to ask questions or talk to me, do that through Slack. And I will keep an eye on that as I teach and try to address things either as I go or at the end. So those are my housekeeping items. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Lambda School, about this course, and what we're doing here. So hopefully you all know what Lambda School is. If you don't, it is a six-month computer science and web development immersive. So it is a course for people who want to get to the point where they can be hired into a full-time web development software engineering position. So it is for people who are complete beginners. It is for people who have some computer science knowledge, for people who perhaps have knowledge in other languages but don't know web development. It's for all those people. And it is entirely online. We teach through video. We interact with our fellow students through Slack. We do group work online, and we have solo time to work on projects. So everything happens remotely, but it is a full-time course. And we do offer one part-time course that only runs twice a year, and that is a year long. So we have options for everyone. And the coolest thing about Lambda School that I will mention again and again, because I think it's great and worth mentioning, is our tuition model. So we do not require you to pay anything up front. One of our big priorities at Lambda School is that everyone have access to a computer science education, regardless of money or location. So we don't charge anything up front. We instead have you pay back your tuition over the first year or 2 years after you are hired. So if you don't get that full-time position making more than $50K, you don't have to pay us. That is the way we set it up to make sure that Lambda School is open for everyone who is ready and able and willing to learn. So that's a little bit about Lambda School for you. Now let's chat just a brief minute about this mini boot camp. This is our kind of pre-course. It's an introduction to some of the topics that you'll be learning in the main curriculum. We are starting at 0, so you don't have to have any computer science or programming experience to take this course. Of course, if you have some experience, you're also welcome to sit in. And if you are interested in taking the hiring challenge, by the end of the boot camp, you should be ready for that. But if you're ready to take our hiring challenge, or not hiring, sorry, admissions challenge. If you're ready to take the admission challenge right away, you're welcome to take that whenever. You don't have to wait till the end of this course if you think you're ready. So if you do have any admissions questions for Lambda School, please reach out to Karen Zachary in Slack. She is the admissions expert. I'll answer whatever I can, but I am just a lowly programming instructor. I don't have all the admission secrets of the universe. So talk to Karen. She's super friendly, and she will answer any questions you have. So that's pretty much the housekeeping items. I'll talk a little bit more about the format of the course at the end once we have a lay of the land. But I'm sure that you guys are eager to get in the meat of things and start to learn. So I want to go ahead and jump in. And one other little item I want to mention, because I see it being mentioned in Slack, is that Yes, this is a live course, but it's also going to be posted on YouTube. And if possible, we recommend that you watch it live so that you can interact and work with your fellow classmates. But if you have to watch one or all of the videos on your own time, you're welcome to do that as well. All right, so let me go ahead and share my screen so we can start talking about computer programming. 1 second. Okay, so up here, I have some computer code. Here it is. So what is this thing on screen? At the simplest level, what I have here is some text in a text editor. So let's just even start by talking about the text editor. Really, I could write this code or any code in any type of text editor, even just Notepad, which is the most basic built-in thing. Generally speaking, that's not what you want to do, though. There are different text editors that work a lot better for computer code. I'm in Sublime Text right now. A couple others I would recommend are VS Code and Atom. You don't actually need a text editor for this course, but you will need one soon, and I would recommend just getting one anyways and starting to play with it. So don't feel like you have to scramble to get Sublime or Atom right now, but good things to keep in mind and maybe to download after the course if you have not already. So for starters, if we're going to write code, we need somewhere to write it. One option would be a text editor. We'll see another option a little later, which is something like CodePen. And once we have a text editor, we can start writing code. So this specifically is HTML code, which is a specific language. It's a specific programming language, and it is specifically designed to create websites. So this code here, really simple, just 7 lines of code, creates a website that has one heading that says code example and one paragraph that says this is a paragraph on a website. So how did I know how to do this? There's clearly some other extra stuff here that I haven't really explained. Well, all programming languages utilize things like keywords and syntax. And that is another reason to use a more advanced editor like Sublime is all my keywords are glowing in red, and that's really helpful for me. So I know that these words glowing in red are keywords that are somehow built into the language. So in order to write code in a language, you need to know what the keywords are, and you need to know how to put them together. So that's what is called syntax. Syntax tells us what types of brackets do we use, what order do things go in, how do we format these keywords and use them in the right way to get the code to run how we want. And as it were, the code it's extremely particular. So because we're communicating not with another human, but with a computer, we have to be precise. If we spell something wrong when we're texting our mom, she's going to know what we're talking about. But if we spell something wrong in our code, then the computer is going to throw an error. It's not all of a sudden, it no longer recognizes this keyword. So this is specifically an HTML example. But there are lots of computer programming languages that have different keywords, different syntaxes. And in a little bit, we'll look at some of those examples to see how different languages do different things or look different. But let's start by taking a closer look at this code here. So we talked about where to write code. We talked about what kind of things we put on the page. And really the last piece of the puzzle is how do we execute our code? How do we make sure that our code is actually doing what we think it's doing? And that's going to depend on the programming language or the type of thing we're writing. In the case of an HTML page, it's actually just a web page. So we can open an HTML page in the browser. So this is just a file saved on my computer called pindex.html, and I can open it in the browser. So let me go over to the browser and open it up and see what happens. So here's pindex.html. I open it up, and sure enough, we see something that corresponds to our code. So we had one header that said code example and one paragraph that said this is a paragraph on a web page, which I know is a little small on screen for you guys. And over here, we see that our code has successfully executed. We've created this extremely simple web page. So that is just one example of what computer programming can be. And I was really excited because before the class, there was a little bit of a discussion about this in Slack and this question of how much does computer programming have to do with computers? And as you might have seen from this example, it doesn't necessarily have that much to do with computers. We certainly need computers to read and run the code, but right now it's really more about this is our tool set. This language, HTML, is a set of tools we can use to build websites. So it really has more to do with logic and building than it does with computers. Of course, the range of what computer programming is and what different languages are is really broad. There are low-level languages that deal with computers directly. I had a friend who worked with things like setting up what do we do if a key on a keyboard is typed, or how should the computer behave when a power button is pressed. That is very computer-oriented computer programming, but something like HTML doesn't really deal with the computer at the most basic level. Some other examples of things we might do with programming, apart from build a website, are we could store and retrieve data from a database. We could build an AI chess player. We could, let's see, I'm totally spacing all of a sudden. We could monitor water flow. We can do just about anything with computer programming. Of course, we're limited by the languages we use. So HTML, this language that I've showed you here, is specifically built for building web pages. I couldn't build an AI chess player using HTML. And some languages are extremely particular in what they can do, whereas other languages are a bit more versatile. So some of the two of the languages we'll see, HTML and CSS, are going to be extremely specific to web development. But we'll also see JavaScript that has a little more wiggle room written in. So here is a bit of HTML code. And now let's talk a little bit more about web development specifically. As I mentioned, there are 3 languages that we're going to be working with HTML, or with web development. One is HTML, another is called CSS, and the last one is called JavaScript. And we will be covering all 3 of those in this course. So let me open a new code base so we can see a quick example of each. And by the way, guys, I don't expect you to fully understand what's going on here. We'll break that down in more detail later. I just wanted to give you guys from the get-go example of what code looks like and what it can do. So let me pull up my code base here. So this is actually a code base, which means it's a collection of files. So we can see another HTML page. It should look a little familiar, but there's a bit more going on than in our last one. In this same file structure, I also have a JavaScript page. Notice that this looks totally different. We still have keywords highlighted in red, but just whereas this page has these little caret brackets, there's none of those here. In JavaScript, we tend to use equal signs and semicolons and parentheses and curly brackets. So just on a visual level, we can see our JavaScript looks different. Same thing with our CSS. Just strictly visually, we see that, yes, there are keywords, but this looks different. So all 3 of these are different languages, and they're designed to do different things. So let me go ahead and open this HTML page, and then we'll look at what the difference is between these 3 languages. So let's open that up, and we can just open it like any other file, and I'll open my index.html here. So here is the web page that is written into this code base. So once again, a code base is just a collection of different files, sometimes in different languages, that all add up to one sort of end product or project, in this case, a web page. So this HTML page is the most basic thing. This tells us what is on the page. It tells us that we have a header. It tells us that we have a button. And whatever visual content is on the page in terms of text or things like buttons, that's all going to be HTML. Next, we have our CSS page. This is our styling page. So notice that as opposed to the last web page I opened, this is a little more styled. There's a scripty font for the header. There's a blue background and a border. There's some white space in between the top and the sides. That is all CSS. So if I go ahead and delete all of this, just get rid of my CSS and refresh the page, now all of a sudden the style is gone. So we still have HTML on the page, but the style, the CSS, is gone. So HTML and CSS go hand in hand, but they accomplish different things. So let me put our style back and refresh this. The last thing I want to talk about is the JavaScript. So the JavaScript happens a little more behind the scenes. Whereas HTML says what's on the page and CSS says how does it look, JavaScript is more like how does it behave. So if I click this button, notice that a new element appears on the page, this new piece of text. That is made possible with JavaScript. So if I go ahead and go to my JavaScript file and I delete this instead and save it and refresh this, now my button doesn't work anymore. So when we're going to a page and we're clicking things, we're submitting data, that's all JavaScript. So let's put that back, save it, and if we refresh the page, we can see that our button works again. So even though this is an incredibly simple web page, it was brought together by 3 languages, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And we will be learning the basics of all 3 in this course. So for tonight and tomorrow, we'll focus on HTML and CSS. And then for the rest of the course, we'll be learning JavaScript. Because even though JavaScript is a little out of sight, out of mind for the regular web user, it's actually a very critical component to how web pages are built. So let's talk a little bit more about what goes into a web page at a high level. And I'm going to go ahead and open up Lambda School's page so that we can explore this. So we can already hopefully start to see some examples of HTML and CSS. Those are going to be the most obvious to us as a user. So we can see that there are some headers on here, a little bit of text, a button, and then a logo, an image, and a nav bar up here. So the presence of all of those pieces of text is all going to be HTML, and even the images as well. But there's style on top of that. This is bigger. This text is bigger than this. We see that our button is red. We see that these bits of text are white, and there's some margins. There's some white space between the edge and the text. There's some white space between this logo and this header. That's all CSS. CSS styles things and makes them look aesthetically enjoyable. There's also some JavaScript going on. When we hover over here, we see that the color changes. That type of dynamic behavior is JavaScript. As well, when we hover here, some new links appear. That's all JavaScript. So all of that is what we would call front-end JavaScript. That is what we see in front of us, is the front end. But there's a whole world going on as well, which is called backend. So for example, if I went to my Facebook feed and all these posts from my friends appear, how do those appear? Well, behind the scenes, there's a database with all the information from all of Facebook's users. So not only does there have to be a database that exists behind the scenes, but there also has to be logic that pulls out just the right posts, the most recent, and the ones that belong to my friends that I should see. So all that behind the scenes logic is called backend JavaScript. And that deals with the storage of data, the creation of new data, the retrieval of data, the submission of data. So there is a whole world of computer programming behind the scenes that we as a user don't really think about. As it were, we won't get into backend JavaScript in this mini bootcamp, but it's something that's covered thoroughly in the main curriculum. So in summary, web development is comprised of 3 different languages: HTML, which covers what is on the screen, CSS, which styles it, and JavaScript, which allows it to be dynamic. It allows things visually to change on hovers and clicks, And it also allows us to submit and retrieve data and interact with the database behind the scenes. So we'll only be scratching the surface of this in this mini boot camp, but by the end of the Lambda School main curriculum, you will know all about front-end JavaScript, back-end JavaScript, and how to build yourself websites and web apps using those tools. All right, so that is a little bit of an introduction to web development. I hope you guys are getting excited about learning these skills. The last thing I wanted to just mention briefly, now that I've hopefully gotten your attention with some programming, is this question of what does it look like to be a software engineer? So I've showed you some code examples. Let me find this code base back here. Here's a code base. So how much of your job as a software engineer is spent actually playing with code like this, either reading or writing, editing, debugging code bases, and how much of it is spent with other things? And of course, the answer is going to depend on what job you get, but I will say that a lot of a computer programming job is actually playing with this stuff, which is really cool, because if you're someone who likes to tinker or create or build or learn new skills or use your head, this is a really great field to get into. My experience is that a lot of my time was often split between actually writing new features, writing code, and debugging, which is more like reading other people's code, trying to understand it, and get through and figure out what's broken and then fix it. So there's a lot of reading code. There's a lot of writing code. There's a lot of, communicating with your other programmers to make sure that you're on the same page. And then there are meetings and there's planning and all that. But it really is, in both my experience and the experience of my friends and colleagues in this field, most of what's on your screen, on your day-to-day life as a computer programmer is this, as well as about 80 tabs open as you Google different things that you're stuck on or trying to understand. So so what we're doing here, though it's a little bit of a simplified version, really looks like what we actually do as a computer programmer. So I just wanted to mention that. And if you have any questions about what is computer programming, or what does it really look like to be a computer programmer, I definitely recommend you asking those types of questions at the end of the lecture, because I'm happy to answer those. So let's go ahead and switch our focus a little bit so that we can jump into a little more coding. So I've just kind of, at this point, mostly talked about what coding is, what do different languages do, and showed you a few examples. But I haven't really given you the skills to actually write your own code very well yet. So let's shift the focus to that. So we're going to focus on HTML tonight. And as a review, HTML is all about what is on the screen. So for example, we would use HTML to say, hey, there should be a header on this page that says a revolutionary new school that invests in you. But HTML does not say what the positioning of this is, if there's margins, how big it is, what color it is. So we won't be doing the styling today, but we will be looking at how to put elements on a page. So for starters, I want to look at this layout diagram. So here is a diagram of a very simple web page. So HTML is made up of elements, which we can think of as being sort of nested boxes on the page. And they won't be perfectly box-shaped always, and sometimes we can squeeze them next to each other, but we can kind of just think of them as a set of nested boxes. So on the very outside, we have this HTML box. This is kind of invisible. It doesn't necessarily correspond to something you see on the page, but every HTML page at the very top level is inside this HTML box. The next thing inside of that is what's called the body. So the body would kind of be considered everything. So for example, this white space on the side that contains nothing, that would be considered the body. So everything on the page is the body. And of course, there are things inside of that, but you would think of the body as encapsulating everything you see when you open a web page. So then within the body, we have different elements. So in this example, the first thing I have within the body at the top is a header. And headers come in different sizes. This one is an H1, which defaults, which you can think of an H1 as being the most important size header. So, and it's not necessarily size oriented. I'll go over that in a minute, but the most important type of header. So at the top, we would have this header. Below that, we have something called a div. And a div is a little weird because it's mostly a container for other elements. So it's not necessarily something we can see on the page, but it's a way of grouping things together. So in the case of this second div, there's a paragraph inside of it. So we have a header, and then below that, a paragraph, which we know is nested in a div, but the div isn't necessarily something we see on page. So below this, we have a second div, which means a second grouping of items. This one has a less important header followed by another paragraph. So this diagram here corresponds to a web page with a header at the top, followed by a paragraph, followed by a smaller header and another paragraph that are grouped together. And that's really, as beginners, how we want to think about this, is these boxes that are nested inside each other. And we'll choose different labels or types of boxes depending on what we want to do, and we'll get into that in a little more detail. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like as an actual web page. So I have the web page version of this saved on here. Let's go ahead and open it. All right, it is right here, and we have this one. Okay, so here is in code form what this image looks like. Where did it go? There it went. Okay, sorry guys. So over here, we have this kind of abstract diagram of how we can think about it. And here we see what the actual page looks like. So notice that there's nothing to indicate that there's an HTML or body container. The HTML thing is kind of invisible. The body just refers to all this white space over here. And to the side is all part of the body. We can see our first header up there. Below it, we can see our paragraph. But we can't necessarily tell that that paragraph's inside of this div box, but it is. And then down here, there's another div box grouping these two together. But once again, it's kind of invisible. But we can see that there's a header and a second paragraph. So one of the things we have to learn when we become programmers is to deal with abstract ideas and invisible items. So this container right now that groups this header and this paragraph together is invisible. But we need to be able to remember that they are grouped together, even if there's nothing visually on the screen to indicate it. So let's go ahead and look at the code that actually renders this. So I'll put that diagram away and pull up the code. Here it is. So we always start by indicating that we're doing an HTML element or HTML page. You won't really have to worry about that for this. We have our HTML container. Up here is something called the head, which is also something that I don't want you guys to worry about. And then down here is our body. And inside our body goes everything that's going to appear on the screen. So we see that here's the code that corresponds to that first header. We have a div that contains this first paragraph. And then another div that contains our second header, which is header 3. So header 3 refers to the type of element, not the number header, because there are only 2, just in case there was any confusion on that. And then following that, another paragraph. So there you go. That's some HTML code. So each thing on the screen, and even some things that we can't even see on the screen, like our divs or our HTML elements, all go into rendering this code. So that's a little bit about how we think about HTML. So let's go ahead and start to write some ourselves. So I've been right now working with doing HTML files on my computer and opening them in the browser, which is a totally valid way of creating HTML. But what we'll do for pretty much the rest of the course is use something called a sandbox environment. In this case, CodePen. So CodePen makes our lives easier. As you hopefully noticed, every time I changed something in my code, I had to save and refresh the page. As well, there was a bunch of other stuff on here that, like this head or this HTML element or this doc type, that I kind of said, hey, let's not worry too much about it right now. So our sandbox environment makes life easier. It means that we can start, we don't have to worry about opening our file. We don't have to worry about the body. We can just start creating elements on the page and they will appear. So if I create another header, notice that it immediately renders on the page. So that is what CodePen is. It's a shortcut that allows us to write HTML code and see it immediately. So CodePen isn't something that you would use if you were creating production code for your company. If you were writing code for a code base that was, for a web app that was going to be going live, you would be writing it in a text editor. But if you just want to play around and experiment with something or learn, then a sandbox environment is perfect. So that's why we use sandbox environments. So you can go through this whole course without ever downloading a text editor or writing anything locally. That's perfectly fine. It's a skill you'll have to learn soon, but you're welcome to just start in CodePen. It's a really easy way to get started. So let's go ahead and look at the code I actually wrote. As we know, there are different types of elements. And once again, elements we can think of as being these different boxes that contain content. So different elements are designed to do different things. As you might imagine, our headers are designed for heading text. And there are 6 different headers, H1 through H6. And by default, they appear in different sizes, each in a slightly smaller size from the last. But we really don't want to think about using them based on size, because size is generally going to be overwritten by our CSS. We think about them as being based on importance. So we want our H1 to be the most important header. And when, for example, if you were Google searching, Google would look at things in the H1 as being the top priority for relevance. So something in an H5 isn't going to come up as being very significant, whereas something in an H1 would be considered critical to the content of the page. So those are headers for you. And let's look at the syntax. So whenever we create a new HTML element, we have to know what the element name is. So this is something that's fixed. I can't make up my own HTML element. I couldn't type out header. Now notice that it's still appearing, but the formatting is all messed up. It doesn't know what a header is. It just knows what an H1 is. So this is a keyword. These elements, tag names are keywords. So they're fixed. They're built into the language. And it's your job to figure out what they are so that you can use them. But you can't really invent your own. That's not how HTML works. So once you have a tag name that you know you want to use, you go ahead and put it in these 2 brackets. And once again, it's important that you get this syntactically correct. If we use these type of brackets instead, now it's confused and it thinks that this is text that you want on the screen. So we have to use the specific type of brackets that HTML calls for. So we go ahead and use an opening tag, which is an element name inside of 2 brackets. Then we can put whatever content we want inside of our element, and then we follow it with a closing tag. We can tell that it's a closing tag because we have a slash before the element name. So everything will be of this format. It will be opening tag, content, closing tag. And that will be true across, for the most part, true across HTML, regardless of what type of element you're using, what type of tag name. So we can see that this header 3 is of that exact same format. Opening tag, content, closing tag. So let's look at some of the other elements that we want to work with. So now let's do a div. And as I mentioned, divs are a little bit invisible by default. They're more of containers. So whereas headers, the content inside them tends to be text, divs tend to contain other HTML elements. Like, for example, a header. So we could put another header inside of our div. So here we go. We have 2 headers kind of floating on their own, and then another one inside of a div. So I want to focus you guys a little bit on this tabbing and white space thing I'm doing. So notice that when I nest an element inside of another one, I tab over. So the code still works if I don't tab or even if I put everything on one line, But one thing that's really important is making sure that our code is clearly readable, both to ourselves and to other developers. So by convention, in HTML, whenever you have an element inside of another element, you tab it over so that it's really easy visually to see, okay, this header is inside of this div. So there we have it. We have this invisible div with a header inside of it. And we can put as many things as we want in here. Generally, you would group like items. So we might say mini bootcamp. Get rid of these other headers for a minute. And then we could type some text about it. So now we have a header and a paragraph, and the content is grouped together, so it would probably make sense to put it in a div. The other reason to put things in divs, and hold on a second while I do some magic, is because once we start adding CSS, then it really matters how we group things together. So if I, for example, added a border around this, now what was before this invisible div element is now visible. We can see where the div starts and ends and everything that's clumped together. So if I put another header down here or another div that contained a different header, we can see that they're separated out. And maybe this has a paragraph that says, there you go. So now we can see that while divs were kind of this mysterious, invisible element before, we can now see that they're a useful way of grouping items together. Whether they're grouped by content or we want them grouped visually, divs are a great way to go. And notice that for everything I'm putting on the screen, it follows the same format of we have an opening tag, we have content inside of it, and then a closing tag. And even within that nested content, once again, opening tag, content, which in this case is just text, closing tag. And that really is the key to HTML, is opening your tags and then closing them. So it's a pretty simple programming language. As I mentioned, it's designed to do one specific thing, which is put content on a web page. So it's not too complex. It will take some getting used to at the beginning, especially if you're new to programming. But it's pretty basic in what it can do because it's designed to do one specific thing. So I've introduced you to the div. I've introduced you to the H1 element, or H1 through H6, and to the paragraph. There's one more element I want to introduce you to, which is called span. So spans are, once again, a little mysterious because at first sight, they seem invisible. So let's say that we wanted to highlight all of the programming languages on this page. What we could do is we could put each of these programming languages in a span element. So this is going to get a little visually ugly. Actually, I'm going to change the content. So we could do night 1, learn HTML basics. And then on night 2, tomorrow night, learn some CSS. So tomorrow we'll learn CSS. So if we wanted to highlight, for example, something inline, so something within the text, like within a paragraph, we could put it in a span. So I'm going to put both programming languages inside of a span. And notice once again, I'm using an opening tag and a closing tag. And the readability here is a little weird. It's kind of up to you if you wanted to like new line this or not. For spans, I personally like keeping them on the same line because it's a little more easy to read. So notice that visually right now, nothing has happened. Just like the divs, these spans by default are invisible. But they become important once we add CSS in the mix because maybe I want to highlight these in red. So using CSS, and once again, this is kind of don't look behind the curtain right now. I can now highlight them in red. So spans are really great if we want to somehow differentiate or style one word or one phrase or one sentence in line. So these are the 4 elements I want to teach you guys today. So we have divs, which are these bigger containers. We have H1s through H6s, which are different headers, and those numbers signify importance. So H1, most important. Next, we have paragraphs, which are exactly what they sound like. They're for text. And then finally, we have spans, which are also invisible containers, but they're more designed to deal with smaller items like words or phrases within a larger paragraph, rather than divs, which more clump-like items together. And as far as when and where to use these elements, it kind of just takes practice and experience, but definitely worth playing around with. As a little review of syntax, in order to create any type of element, we always start with an opening tag. Those go in brackets. Then we put content inside of them and close them. And the closing tag looks exactly like the opening one, except there's a slash in it. So that is the basics of HTML for you guys. That is how we do it. So that's pretty much all the programming I wanted to teach you guys tonight. It's pretty basic, but it's a good place to start, and we'll dive in a lot deeper tomorrow. So I'm going to wrap up our lesson by talking a little bit more about the format of this class. So how each night will look, how homework's going to look. Then I'll briefly go over the homework for tonight, and then finally I will open the floor to questions. So I know I've seen some questions floating around in Slack as we go. I'll try and address ones that have already passed, but if you have a question that's gone unanswered, just post it again once we get to the question section. But let me go over a few more things first. So each night, if you're attending the class live, each night will go from 5 to 8 Pacific time. And roughly speaking, the first hour or so will be instruction time. Sometimes it's an hour, sometimes it's closer to an hour and a half. It just depends on what we're learning and how many questions there are. So we'll do live instruction followed by a Q&A every time. Then you will receive the homework. So as long as you have given your name and email via Slackbot, you will be assigned a project manager, which is someone who will help facilitate the homework portion. So after the instruction ends, you will receive a link to the homework. So that will be given to you. So if we're getting a lot of questions about where's the homework, just be a little patient once the video ends, because it will come to you. So you will have solo time, about an hour to maybe an hour and a half, to work on your homework. And I will say these homework assignments are tricky. They are designed to challenge you. So don't be too discouraged if you're struggling with the homework, because they're meant to test your limits. Just do the best you can, and you're welcome to continue working on them in your own time if you'd like. After the homework section, we will get together in groups, and then you'll discuss the homework, talk about issues you had, talk about different people's answers. So that's the format of each night. If you can't attend live, that's totally fine. The videos are available online, and there will be a group for people who are doing it on their own time so that they can get the homework and work on it on their own time. So we are flexible to that. We understand not everyone has 3 hours every night to give to this, though I greatly appreciate those of you guys who are able to attend live. It's really great to be able to interact with you. So that is the overview of how this will work. We're always available in Slack for questions. I know it's tough the first couple nights when you're still getting your bearings. And then let me just go over a few things for the homework for tonight, and then we can jump into the Q&A. So the homework for tonight and tomorrow will be in CodePen. So you'll be receiving a CodePen link. So here's what will happen. For starters, in the JS tab, you'll see that you have 2 assignments that are question-based. So a lot of the homework is going to be actual coding or reading of code, but on the first night, we go a little more high level. But I do recommend that you actually spend your time answering these questions, and the recommended amount of time for each is 3 minutes. And I promise you, you will get a lot if you actually spend the 3 minutes reflecting on each of these questions in the first section. There's a lot to be said about each of them. The next exercise involves inspecting a website. And I'll go over what that entails in a minute because I'm going to do a little tutorial of that in just a second. So once again, this is more about playing around with some existing code and answering questions. Finally, your last assignment will be in the HTML tab. So you'll pull this over and you'll actually be writing some HTML on here. There is code in the CSS tab. Just leave it alone. It'll help you visualize, but you shouldn't be messing with that. I mean, if you finish everything and you're feeling really good and excited, feel free to play with the CSS, but if you're still trying to answer the questions, leave this alone. So this is what you'll be receiving a link to this, and this will be your homework for tonight. So the last thing I have to go over about the homework is this idea of inspecting a web page. So let me give you a little clue on how to do that. So once again, I'm going to open Lambda School's website and check it out. So if you go ahead, I'm in Chrome right now. It could be slightly different in different browsers, but if you go ahead and right click, you can see something called inspect. So if you inspect just the background, the body, it'll open a little HTML guide to the whole web page. So you can highlight different things and say, okay, here's the whole body. There's a div here. Within that, there's another div, etc. That's a div. This is a div. And there's this little sidebar here where you can actually look at the elements. And this works on any web page. So let's go and do it for Google instead. So if I open this and inspect, if I click on a specific element, it'll open that specific element. So over here, if I wanted to see this button, I could inspect it. And over here, it actually takes me to, and as it were, this isn't actually a button. It's something called an anchor that you will learn about later. But you can see some familiar things like this text is an H3. We can see that there's a div here. We can see that up here, that's an H1, and this is actually a separate H1. So you will be playing around with this on your own. And it's a little overwhelming because these web pages online are way more complex than what we've looked at today. But don't be overwhelmed. The point of this exercise is to just play around, explore, mess with it. So as a reminder, if you want to see a specific element, go ahead and hover over it, right click and go inspect, and it will open a little information about that element on the sidebar here. So there you go. So that is how to inspect. It's a fun thing to do in general. I would recommend that you start to, for now, make a habit out of when you're going to new web pages, just take 1 minute to inspect it. And it'll kind of shift your mindset from thinking like an internet user to a builder of web pages, which is the exact mindset shift that we want to happen in this class. So kind of a fun, neat thing to know how to do and critical for one of our homework assignments tonight. So I wanted to go over that. Last thing I wanted to mention is we do have a syllabus. I will go ahead and actually send that out in Slack. So coming in Slack right now. There you go. So there's your syllabus. So if you want to see what we're up to each night and try to figure out what the objectives are, you're welcome to follow along in the syllabus as we go along. So that's another little resource for you. As a reminder, I think the biggest resource we provide for you is Slack. There are TAs available to help. I am on Slack, and you're welcome to message me directly, but I'm not always the best person to ask things. I'm not always online, and I'm not always available to answer right away. But if you want to reach out to me, feel free. Otherwise, just keep having conversations about this stuff in Slack. So that is all the things you need to know, but now we have a bit of time for questions. So whether your questions are about Lambda School or computer programming or, the hiring process, really anything is welcome. And of course, if you have questions about the actual coding components, also welcome. So let's open up the floor to some questions. And just so you guys know, there's a slight delay between what I see and what you see. So I'm waiting on a couple people typing, and then I'll address those questions. Yeah, we have a comment about my battery level. I think we're good to go. It's I try to plug my computer in, but it's a good way to make sure I don't talk to you guys for too long. I figure if I'm still lecturing by the time my computer dies, then I've probably lectured for too long. Now, an actual technical question is about divs inside of divs. So we had this over here, we just had some H's and some P's inside of divs, and there's this question of could we put more divs inside of divs? And that is not only allowed, but actually extremely common. So if I wanted to, I could put a div inside of this div and separate things out. And then maybe down here, we have something else inside of a different div. So let's get the tabbing right here. Sorry. So now we have, it's kind of hard to see on here. Let me do one more CSS magic thing. Cool. So now it's a little clearer what's going on here. So we have, if I closed all my divs properly? No, I haven't. Oh, okay, there we go. Okay, so now we have this div. Now we have this div here that contains two other divs, and that's totally allowed. And in fact, if we go back over here and inspect, we often find in these production websites that we'll see a div inside of a div containing another div, containing another div. So this is like, I think we're like 5 or 6 divs deep over here. So the Lambda School site has like 7 divs inside of divs, and that's really normal. So yeah, we can continue to nest divs ad infinitum. Okay, let's see. A few other questions. Let's see what we've got here. So as far as visualizing, CSS will really help, and we will learn CSS tomorrow. The code for tonight is set up so that you should be able to see what the different elements are. So it should be that CSS code I told you not to touch will set you up so that it's easier to see where the invisible elements are. Let's see. There is a question about the due date for assignments. So it's pretty flexible. If ideally you want to try and work on things in real time, and that's why we set aside the 3 hours each night for everything. But realistically, a lot of people don't finish all the homework, and it's kind of up to you to get it done in your own time. So I know a lot of people actually, because the course is so fast-paced, will come back and work on their homework after the fact. So that's pretty normal. It's just up to you. I would just say set things at a pace where you're being challenged, but you're not feeling completely swamped or like your head is melting. If you feel like your mind is melting in sort of a perpetual state, even though the course lasts for 2 weeks live, give yourself a little bit more time to work on the homework, go back through, look at the videos again. It's really common for people to do this, and we do teach you a lot in just 2 weeks. So other questions. Is Lambda more in-depth than learning HTML through Coursera? I've done a little bit of Coursera. I'm not super familiar with that, but to my understanding, yes, it's quite more in-depth, both because we provide you with a whole infrastructure. There's classmates you're working with, live instruction, and I don't believe that that is provided through that, as well as not just learning HTML, but learning the whole spectrum of programming. So you might have to do more research on that, but as far as I know, we go much farther and deeper than they do. Let's see some other questions. There's a question about, will we need webcam use for this class? Nope. I'm the only person. You get to see me, but I don't get to see you. So no need for webcam in this course. We had a question about when to use span elements. For the homework tonight, you really just want to practice actually putting them on the page. Since you won't be doing any styling yourself tonight, your spans will be mostly invisible, but just to practice them, just put them, if you want to highlight a word or a phrase, that would be a good place to put spans. As far as where to put spans, if you're actually creating a production site, that's going to really depend on visually what's going on. So if the design team has requested that there be a paragraph with one word or one phrase highlighted, that is when you as the programmer would add a span. And in some cases, the programmer and the design team are the same person. So in that case, it'd be up to you to decide when a span would be necessary. All right, I'm getting tons of questions, so I'm probably accidentally skipping some, and I apologize for that. I'll get to however many I can. So we have someone asking, is it difficult to work both as a web designer and full stack web developer? To me, that just requires different skills. So for me personally, design is not my forte. I'm not good at making things look pretty. So I'm really good at the logical components of it. I do front end things, but tend to do more JavaScript oriented, and I really prefer backend. So for me personally, being both a web designer and a full stack web developer doesn't work too well. And you'll often find people who are the opposite, people who are really good at the visual component, but aren't as good at some of the hard logic data analytical stuff. And oftentimes you'll have someone who specializes in one or the other. But I also know plenty of people who are really good at both. So to me, it just depends on what your strong suit is. If you're someone who's both very visually oriented and very abstract oriented, you could probably do both swimmingly. That being said, part of the fun of web development is working on things that aren't your strong suit. So even though design isn't my strength, sometimes I've had to do design work. I just have to ask other people if it looks okay or not. So it really depends on the person. And for bigger companies, usually it's going to be separated out. So if you're working for a bigger company, you'd probably have an entire design team who just does design. But if you're working for a little startup that just has 6 employees or 4 employees, you might be the person who does everything. Okay, so we have a question about what div stands for. So div is a divider. And if you're curious, and someone just posted a little link in W3 Schools. So all of this stuff I'm teaching is very Googleable. So if you ever have a question, like, what does div stand for? Definitely ask me, because it makes me feel important, but you can also Google it, and a bajillion people online will tell you. W3 Schools is a really good site for just kind of a basic look at what is everything. So here, for example, is every single HTML tag. As I mentioned, HTML tags are built in. So they're not something we can make up, but there are a ton. As it were, in real life, we tend to only use a handful of these. But these all exist, and they're all things that are out there and that you might potentially use. So we'll learn a few more tomorrow, but for the most part, we won't learn many of these. So if you want to, you're welcome to go to W3 Schools and explore this a little bit, but I promise you, I don't know anywhere close to all of these tags. There are a bunch that are rarely used here. So we have a question about W3 Schools and is it really the best place to go? Another good place that was mentioned online is MDN. So MDN is, I personally prefer MDN if I have a deeper question. So this is another, well, that's JavaScript. We don't want JavaScript. Let's try MDN HTML. So this is another really good resource online. My experience is if you're just interested in a reference, like for example, if you just want to know, hey, what are all the HTML elements? I like W3 schools. It's good for high-level reference stuff. If you're really trying to understand something deeply, it can be kind of confusing. So I would recommend, I mean, I am really a big fan of YouTube, honestly. If you have a more deep question, I would check YouTube. That's the first place I go. But if you're just like, oh crap, I can't remember if it's div or divide or what, a great place to just look up things is W3 schools, but not the best place for deeper understanding. Okay, we had a question about, is Lambda School just for learning front-end development? So this mini bootcamp will only deal with front-end development, but the Lambda School main curriculum covers so much more. So we do full stack development in the main curriculum. We do front-end and back-end. We also cover some frameworks, which are essentially, the simplest way to explain a framework is it's like an add-on to a language. So a JavaScript framework would be something you add on to JavaScript to make it even more powerful for web development. So we learn full stack development in the main curriculum, and then we also learn some just general computer science topics. So we'll dive into a few other languages like Python and C and talk about algorithms, data, things like that, so that it's actually a really well-grounded, well-rounded education in that you're getting the practical, the, you know, in the trenches, how do you do this side of it, but you're also getting a little more of that academic side of computer science. So it's a really good blend of topics. Connor asks about Bootstrap. So for anyone who doesn't know, Bootstrap is a front-end framework. It's a CSS framework. So it will make everything that we learn tomorrow even easier. In this mini bootcamp, we don't do any framework, so no Bootstrap. But we have an entire Bootstrap unit in the main curriculum. So that is something that you will learn if you do the full-time course. We also have a question about covering JavaScript in the mini bootcamp. So yes, that's actually the main thing we cover. We'll do HTML and CSS tonight and tomorrow. Obviously, we didn't do too much CSS tonight, but we'll do a lot more tomorrow. And then we'll spend a week and a half covering JavaScript. I see a few more people typing, so I'll wait for those questions to come through. So there's a question about cross-browser compatibility. So no, that is a little bit too advanced for the scope of this bootcamp. That cross-browser compatibility is a really interesting topic that you guys are welcome to Google if you're curious about, but that is not something that will be covered in the mini bootcamp. Question about the length of the bootcamp. It will be 2 weeks, so Monday through Thursday this week and next week. And a question about how closely will this bootcamp mimic the experience of the Lambda program, the main Lambda program. So we try to mimic it as best as we can. The main Lambda course is not on YouTube. We use a different piece of software called Zoom, but it is similar in that it's a blend of live instruction plus homework time. There's not as much, solo project time, and we're not able to work on projects. Whereas in the main curriculum, you might be working on a project over a series of time. Because this is so fast-paced, it's more homework-oriented than project-oriented. But beyond that, we do try to mimic the main curriculum as best as we can to get you guys a taste for what you're signing up for. So we have a question about a little bit more about what is a web developer, what's a software developer. Another question about is web development for web pages or for apps. So I'm going to answer all of those questions together. So a software developer is a little more of a general term. For example, some software is, could be software that's for internal use. So software covers a lot of different things. Whereas web developer is website specific or web app specific. So for example, At my old job, I did some data aggregation software. There was no website or web app involved in that, so you wouldn't call that web development. That would be a more general type of software development, whereas web development would be a more specific term for anything that's web-based. And web development does include web pages and web apps. So a lot of the same tools go into both, and that's what we'll be learning in the Lambda School main curriculum. So it's both for apps and for websites. And really we focus a little more on apps because apps are a little more interesting than websites. So it's really app oriented. No one asked about this, but a really related topic is mobile apps. So the skill set for mobile apps and web apps they're similar, but there is a bit of difference. So I do know plenty of people who do both, but I also know plenty of people who specialize in one or the other. Lambda School is oriented towards web development and web apps, not necessarily mobile apps, but you learn a lot of similar skills. And I know people who have gone through web development boot camps and still gotten mobile jobs. So there is a bit of overlap, but there's also some skills that you might not learn in this course for mobile development. We have a question about multi-monitor setup. So yeah, a monitor is a great thing to invest in as a programmer. It's really, I was resistant towards getting a monitor for a long time when I started doing coding because I'm kind of cheap and lazy. But it's extremely useful. It's really nice to be able to have 2 different files on screen at once, or 3 different files, or to have your Slack window in one place if you're communicating with other project members, or the actual web page on one screen and the code on the other. It's really useful to have a monitor. So that is something that I would recommend investing in as you become a programmer. But it's not necessary. It's just helpful. If you find yourself flipping between 2 different files way too often, maybe invest in a monitor. So we have a question about basic HTML versus HTML5. The HTML we cover in this course is pretty basic. So we're really just building the fundamentals in this course. However, there's a lot of overlap, and certainly the skills that you're learning in this mini boot camp are going to apply directly to learning HTML5 or other, more modern tools. We have a question about tabs or spaces. I just format my Sublime. So to clarify that, if anyone is curious what we're talking about, there's kind of this question of when you tab over, do you do space, or do you do just a single tab? So I format my Sublime text so that when I press tab, it appears as spaces. So voila. So I press the tab key, but it formats the spaces. Really one of those like little detail-oriented things that programmers totally care about, but maybe doesn't matter that much in the end. So we have a question about if, do you wait until you're finished with the boot camp before applying to the main curriculum, or just go for it? And that really is going to depend personally. If you are brand new to programming or web development, I would recommend going through this mini boot camp. And even if you're not brand new to it, but pretty new, I would probably recommend going through the boot camp, or the mini boot camp, excuse me. But if you have a little more experience with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, if a lot of this feels like review, you're welcome to go ahead and apply for the course right now. And once again, reach out to Karen Zachary about that. And if you have any questions about if you should apply now or wait, just reach out to her and have a little conversation with her. And she can probably help you figure that out a little better than I can. We have a question about programming jobs being available remotely. As with anything, it's going to just depend. There are a lot of remote jobs. Sometimes it can be a little harder to get a remote job because generally remote jobs want to fly you out to meet you in person. and that's a little bit more investment on their part. So it can be a little trickier, especially as a beginning developer, to get a remote job, because companies might be a little less willing to fly you out with less experience under your belt, but it's certainly possible to get a remote job from the get-go. And I would say, yeah, more and more they're becoming common as these online tools for collaborating get more and more sophisticated. So we have a question about job titles for computer science jobs. So computer science is a really broad category. As far as what you would learn in this boot camp, I would look for software engineer, software developer, web designer, and really you'll also be looking based on languages. As it were, though, we have a full hiring team so that when the time comes for you to actually be applying for the jobs, there are people there who are experts in how to find those jobs. That is not my specialty. Okay, we have a bunch of questions about admissions. I'm going to try and answer most of them, but yes, Karen Zachary is a great resource if I don't get all of them. So let me look at this big question about admissions. So will we be tested on everything we learn? So you will receive homework on everything you learn, and then there will be a comprehensive assignment at the end. As far as being officially accepted into the program, there is a challenge that is part of the hiring process. And it won't necessarily deal with everything we learn in this course, but learning the material in this course is a good way to prepare for that. There are two sides to getting accepted. One is the coding challenge. The other is the interview. And the interview isn't technical. It's more about making sure that you're really excited about this. You understand what you're signing up for. You're willing to put in the effort. You're the kind of person who can collaborate and work with others. We really are less concerned with what you know right now and more concerned with what you're capable of learning. So we mostly want you to demonstrate to us, both through the interview and the coding challenge, that you're really willing and able to learn, rather that you're a master of all this material so far. As to when the program starts, every month we have a full-time program starting, and then the part-time program starts twice a year. I believe we have one coming up soon, but for that exact date, you would have to ask Karen Zachary. So those are a few common questions you might have, but once again, Karen is the person to talk to. All right, so I am still getting flooded with questions, but I will say that anything homework related, that will be explained to you in due time. So as far as the format for the homework, where it is, how to submit it, that will all be explained to you on Slack in just a minute. As far as contacting Karen, just reach out to her through Slack. All right, I think I am going to close up the questions section so that we can get on to our homework. So thank you all for all those excellent questions. Keep asking them in Slack. If you keep asking them in this channel, we'll get to them all in due time. And then if you have any admissions questions, you can just reach out to Karen directly. Well, thank you guys so much for joining me for this first lecture of the Lambda School Mini Bootcamp. We will have another lesson tomorrow night at the same time. So I hope to see you all there, and good luck with the homework tonight. Definitely reach out in Slack if you have any questions, and good luck with that. And we will see you tomorrow. All right. Have a good night.